Hi, my name is Brian Mitke. I'm a lifelong resident of Lewis County. I'm the founder of a group that is celebrating the bicentennial of the founder of our city of Centralia. We're founded by George Washington. It wasn't the President George Washington, he was a pioneer who was born in 1817 in Virginia. He crossed the American continent and really had a remarkable life. He was born of a white mother and a black slave father. And his story really is just something that we're very excited about in Centralia. And we'd like to tell you a little bit about George today, about our city of Centralia, and about the 200th birthday party that we're going to have for him. With me today I have Edna Fund, who is a county commissioner of Lewis County. She's a resident of Centralia. She is a historian. And Edna, tell us about George and why you're here.
Well, I appreciate George Washington, our founder of our town. When you think about George Washington, as you said earlier, think of president. Well, he is our founder. He's the one that determined that this was a good place to put on the map. And as I worked as a researcher in a land called Lewis, we found out a lot of interesting facts about him. And what I'm thinking about, we're not just celebrating his birthday just one day, we're doing a whole year of it. Because when you think about it, many of us will say, oh, I'm celebrating my birthday week, which I just had, but we're celebrating the whole year for him because his rich history deserves that.
Thank you, Edna. And we also have with us Jean Bloom, who is a longtime history researcher, and she is also a recreationist. She has brought a lot of our historical characters to life. This summer, she is going to bring George's wife, Mary Jane, to life as well. So, Jean, thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome. Well, I'm an long-time teacher, a retired teacher, and I was so proud that I'd be able to tell my students about this famous man that gave his life, really, to give to the Centralia heritage and to the history. And each one of my students had a surprise that they felt honored that they could talk about him and they could learn about him. And so teaching's been really important to me. So when I retired, I decided that I wanted to talk about a lot of the pioneer women, especially in our area, because the men I really admired, but the women didn't even have a first name sometimes. And so I chose Mary Jane Kunis to portray, and that started this whole thing.
It's great to learn about our history, and this year in Centralia we're going to be doing a lot of that. We'd love to have folks come down and join us there. This month in May, we're going to be doing a cleanup of the park, or the cemetery that George donated to the city. June 10th, Jean is going to be portraying Mary Jane Kunis at the Borst Home. And our biggest celebration that we're going to have to start off a year of events is August 12th, which is the Saturday before George Washington's 200th birthday. We're going to have a big party in downtown Centralia in George Washington Park, which is the city square that he donated to the city, our central park. So we'd love to have folks come and join us on August 12th. We're going to have a year of events. We're going to culminate with the dedication of a statue of George and Mary Jane Washington that we're just getting started building now. Bronze statue that's going to be in the park. And so we'd love to have folks participate in that as well. It's just really exciting to honor a great man who's a notable historical figure. And I think all of us would agree he was just really a moral giant as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about George's life today, and including his birth. Any of you guys want to talk about George's birth and how he ended up not becoming a slave? Because that was really a danger for him.
So when you think about how he began, that he had a white mother and he had a black father who was a slave. And then shortly after he was born, his father was sold. So when you think about it, here's this young man, and what happened? Well, thank goodness for the Cochrans, don't you think?
Yeah.
That said, we'll raise him until he's 21 as our foster son. So when you think about back then in those times, that probably was not an easy thing to do.
No.
But it did happen.
So his mother gave up her baby. He faced life of slavery, so she gave him to a couple of her friends, James and Anna Cochran. You want to tell us about that, Jean?
Well, yes, and as I said, it wasn't easy for her to do this, but she gave him to just the right person, to the right couple, because they cherished him and they taught him so many things. I mean, ordinary, they taught him to use a rifle, and they taught him to grow things from the ground, and they taught him to sew. It's interesting, as a young man, he could sew things and make garments for himself and his family.
It came natural to him, didn't it?
It did. He was a talented, very creative young man. And they settled there in, was it Missouri?
Missouri.
Yes. And interesting thing about that, as he grew older, he made a distillery there. And then he found out after he had built this big brick home and the distillery, he found out that he couldn't own anything like that.
And Jean, you think about this other piece of his life growing up, that he taught himself how to read.
Yes.
Because schools were not allowed to teach them how to read, teach the black children, and he learned how to read.
And it's amazing. As they came west, he was a black foster child of this white couple, and like you say, he built a home for himself. He owned a business, and because of the frankly just the racist laws that existed at the time in Missouri, he was almost jailed because he demanded that one of his customers pay his bill.
Right.
And the customer found a law saying, you know, as a black man, in fact, you're at fault, even though I'm the guy who didn't pay my bill. So amazingly, George's father helped, but the Missouri legislature passed a law saying this man, George Washington, is exempted from a lot of these racist laws, and he has the rights of a freedman. So it was kind of the first, but not the last time that George managed to escape some of these racist laws.
No, when they came on further, he sold that and got his oxen, and he started out across the prairie with a small team. And it was interesting that the way I saw it was he never had a bitterness. He never had anger.
Right. He had every reason to be bitter.
Yeah, and he just took everything in his stride, and he brought the old folks, as he sometimes called them, with him across, and then they settled in the Oregon Territory.
Yeah, and they came across, and 117 days to cross the prairie, and they had some really amazing adventures along the way. And he brought along his 2 foot long shears?
Yes.
Yeah, his sewing scissors. He brought along the thick family Bible, and he brought along his rifle. So he really,
The 3 important things.
yeah,
Yes.
he had this pioneer experience. And they arrived in Oregon, and I guess that was the second time where he encountered these racist laws. I didn't know this, but Oregon Territory had laws against blacks settling there.
Right.
So when he came to Oregon, he really had no ability to even live there. And that was actually the reason I think that he came to Centralia was the seat of territorial government in Oregon. He kind of came as far away from that as he could up to the Centralia area. And it was far enough away that maybe he could fly under the radar screen a little bit. So when you guys want to talk about kind of how he came up to Centralia and what he found when he got there and what he did?
Well, he was one of the first people here. And I also wanted to say there was also a George Washington Bush that was in Tumwater. And so people kind of confused the two, but ours is George Washington of Centralia.
So there were 2 Georges, and they were both black pioneers
Yes.
who came here. And George Bush, who settled up in Tumwater, it was the same reason he came to that area, because it was far enough from the seat of government that he could get some land. And both George Bush and George Washington, they weren't legally allowed to live there. And George Bush actually had to have an act of Congress to give him the right to live on the land that he had homesteaded. And George Washington was a similar deal. His neighbors, you know the story about how he almost lost his land that was stolen from him?
Yes, he had already made a cabin. He was doing just fine, and 2 men came by and said something about his land, and he knew right away this was bad. So he went down to the Cochrans, and they were living not with him at that time, but down at Cochrane Landing, they called it, and he said, you need to come and help me. And so then Mr. Cochrane went and claimed the land.
For $200.
$200. He paid him. Yeah, and then after that, then he put in his claim for 640 acres, and then that was in their name still. And then, do you want to go on from there?
Well, when I think about the Cochrans, they were elderly, and he always took care of them, but they were ones, when they were there and saw that he was going to lose his land, they jumped. They didn't hesitate. They just jumped right in to help him with that.
He built another room on his house, and they moved in with him. From then on, he took care of them.
It was an amazing story where, as a child, he had been given to this family, and his white mother, when she gave up her baby forever, she asked them to raise him until he was 18, and they did that. And then they they switched, and they came with him, and then he promised them when they came west that he would take care of them for life. So it's really a beautiful family that was created. And
I wanted to add one more thing about his white mother, because when he was in Vancouver, Fort Vancouver, he became very, very ill. In fact, his illness was so bad that he lost all of his hair, and it never came back in. And his adopted mother, she would go every single day and take food there and visit with him and everything in the hospital. And one day she brought along a white woman, and the white woman visited with him. And later on, she said to George, "That was your mother." And so she had come west, and she apparently had 4 white daughters.
Yeah.
But he never saw her again.
Yeah, it was a lot of separation and a lot of exclusion at those times. And when they came up to Centralia, George came up and he settled in an area that was where the Chehalis River and the Skookumchuck River come together. It's a prairie there. If you're driving on Interstate 5, you come through Centralia. It's kind of right in between the 2 Centralia exits there. You look out, there's a lake there now. There's a lake right in the middle of where his homestead was, an old gravel pit. And he homesteaded that. He and his white foster father kind of came up to a clever arrangement to allow George to settle there. And George lived there and farmed it, and his elderly step-parents ended up coming to live with him. And we're talking the pioneer experience. They had to go out to the frozen over river and whack out holes in the river to get water for the livestock. And then as his parents got old, it was kind of neat. George really cared for them. He kind of nursed them when they were getting old, and then some neighbors. There weren't very many pioneers at the time, but
yes. Oh, I want to talk about
neighbors.
Mary and Joseph Boris, because that is my specialty. And the Boris Park has become a museum, a living museum, and I get the guides and everything to go through.
And where is it locally now? When you
how do you get to the Boris?
How do you get there?
Okay, well, a roundabout way. But you go past the middle school, and then you go past the sports arena and all of the many fields, and then there's the Boris House. And he also claimed 640 acres, and and gave the land to the city of Centralia to make the park. But what I wanted to say about George Washington was that he called them the old folks, and when he was working almost on day and night, and they were getting old, he would take them over to Mary's house, and he'd move in the winter with them. So she would take care of them, they'd keep them really warm and good. So there was a lot of play back and forth between all of the pioneers. At first, they'd have to go 3 miles to get a needle, a thread, and then of course George bought the first sewing machine.
Oh,
and
that's
went
right.
back to sewing all the things. And they said that he could take those shears and make a pattern for himself and make a shirt for himself in 2.5 hours. Now, I would like to be able to do that.
Right. And wasn't his wife also a really good seamstress?
Oh, yes. She folded all, and he helped her, and she'd put it on, and he'd fold all the seams, and then saw that they just fit her perfectly.
And the famous photo of him with his dog there that we see on the screen, he, I believe, sewed those clothes himself. That was his.
Yes. Oh, his Sunday suits.
Yeah.
And then remember, he had a brown wig for every day, but on Sunday he wore his black wig to church. And remember, he set aside the land. What year was that? What he set aside the land for the church and for the town square.
Yeah, yeah. And so when he was a pioneer, and then other homestead neighbors, and gradually the town started, or the area started to grow up a little bit. But let's talk about his marriage, because he really had an amazing wife with a life story that was just really remarkable. So he was a bachelor living out here in the Wild West. And tell us about his wife, Jean.
Well, she had a good background too. She had come from Hawaii, and then recently she came from Victoria, Canada. She had one son, Stacy.
And her name was?
Mary Jane Kunis.
Mary Jane Kunis, okay.
Yes, and she was just as talented as he was, and just as excited about Centralia. So when they decided to lay out the plot of Centralia, just those 4 and plotted, and then they walked the railroad track all the way to Chehalis under Mr. West to claim this land and to plot it at the city hall. Well, it just meant that both of them had a dream, had a vision of what this land would be like and what it would come out to be. And just think, for him to be in such dire conditions and everything like that, and still carry on, and the two of them just made it a place where people wanted to come. Sold the lots for, wasn't it
$10, I think.
$10.
Yeah.
And he never wanted to sell to anyone who wasn't good. He said, I'd rather
He-
burn
in-
the house down than sell to someone who would do something bad in my house.
He interviewed them.
Oh.
He wanted to know about them. And I just want to take you back when we're talking about when he almost lost his land and the Oregon legislature, the Oregon Territory legislature, when they talked about that he could still have his land years later in 1852, they said Thurston County. And back then, Thurston County was all the way south to where Centralia was. So that was before the real Lewis County was formed. So so if you read that, that's why it's a bit confusing, but it was still Centralia area, but then it was Thurston County, now it's Lewis County.
And that petition, it was for the second time in his life, he had a legislature explicitly pass a law giving him the rights that any man should have. And on the one hand, it's just a shame that was required, that a black man didn't have rights unless the legislature gave it to him. And that's something important for us to remember. On the other hand, it really is a sign of what a great man he was, that there's a sheet, I mean, it's a long sheet, I don't know if it was parchment or what, but that showed all of the neighbors. I mean, he had 50
Yes.
or 60 neighbors that
Signed.
signed this petition saying, this guy, George Washington, is great, and you need to let him stay here because we need a neighbor like this. This is a great guy. And that's part of, I think, why all three of us are here and why the bicentennial has a lot of energy in Centralia, is he was just a guy that we would all be proud to claim as our founder. He was a generous guy. He was an industrious guy. He was an honest man. So it's exciting. So I did want to talk a little bit about. So he and Mary Jane are married. They have their farm. Things are going pretty well. And then the railroad comes through, and this is a big deal. So what was that, 1872, something like that?
2 or 3, I think, maybe, 1873.
Yeah, 1872, it says
Okay, two.
in the land called Lewis. And so George Washington watched the railroad cross his land, is how they put it. That suddenly, kind of an
And
intruder.
that was a big deal. It's like all of a sudden Interstate 5 is coming through your property.
Yeah.
There's
Yes,
some
like-
development potential now. So he decided to take advantage of that development potential.
And added more plots to his city, Centerville, remember at first?
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, so he and Mary Jane laid out, they said, let's form a town. So they had his 640 acres and they laid out the streets. And Mary Jane, who was from Louisiana originally, how did we end up with Magnolia Street
Yes.
in Centralia where
Yeah.
we don't have native magnolia trees? And then you want to talk about that?
Well, she did go to Hawaii, so she had that kind of perspective in terms of other plants. And she was also had religion. So like Gold Street.
And Pearl.
And Pearl. I mean, and she has, how can I say it, a view from her past that she put into Centralia. So when we see those streets, and I mean, she liked trees,
So we
cherry
have-
tree, oak tree, and you think alder.
Maple.
Yep.
We've got all those trees, whether we have those like Magnolia here, but it came from her history.
And then the pearly gates and the streets of gold in
Gold.
heaven. So downtown
Yes.
Centralia is literally named for the her heavenly vision from her deep Christian faith. And that's one thing that's neat and that we're really excited about in our bicentennial is that Centralia was founded by an African American couple, and it really was a cooperative effort where
definitely.
you were saying, Gene, that they walked together down to Chehalis was the seat of the county at the time, and they filed the plat together. Mary Jane and her son, George's stepson,
Yes.
Stacy Kunis Jr. had laid that out and named the street. So it's a neat family story as well. And in that statue that we're going to build, we're going to have George and Mary Jane and their dog, because everybody loves their dog. And we're talking about having that map of downtown Centerville. They call it
Yes.
Centerville there, because it was their dream, and that was his legacy. Centralia is George's legacy, and as the town of Centerville grew, there's a whole story about how there was already a Centerville in eastern Washington. It was very, very confusing, so they decided to rename it, and they had a new immigrant who had come from Centralia, Illinois, right?
Yes.
And he said, we have Centralia back home. It's
Yes.
a great name. Why don't you call it that? So they renamed it from Centerville to Centralia. And as the town grew, George would build lots. He would develop lots. And like we were saying, would sell them at a price that was a lot less than he could have gotten because he wanted to have a good class of people
Right.
settle there.
Right.
Oh, and one thing I wanted to be sure about is when times got hard, he was his own Lend-Lease.
Right.
We thought that maybe the whole town would have gone to be a ghost town during the very bad years
Depression.
when Depression came and hit with all of the industries. But he would give a man who was really down, he would give him a little bit of food for his family and everything like that. And then he'd say, in exchange for that, you work for me so that you deserved it, kind of. It was like he wanted him to feel good about it. He didn't want to be giving him something and not having him feel good about it. And I think that whole idea is kind of in Centralia, that people want, in the whole city, they kind of want to take part and to make it better because of this idea that came all along that each person is very important. They were very important to him.
And I've read where his son or his stepson told about the wheelbarrow that George had that had coins in it. He didn't want the cash. He didn't want that. He wanted the coins.
Gold coins.
Gold coins. And he was really willing to share with people, but he wanted them to work for it. But he really saved Centralia by some of the business dealings he did before the big depression, because he was offered some money to do some other things, but he decided things weren't going so well, so he wasn't going to go with some of the other options that were available to him, and he got those coins in that wheelbarrow and saved Centralia.
Yeah, during this economic depression in the 1890s.
94, 95, 96
Yeah.
were all very
It was bad. It was as bad as the Great Depression
Yes, it
was
was.
in the 1930s later. And people were just saying, I can't pay. I gotta go. And he would say, no, that's fine. Stay here. We'll work it out. If you can't pay me right now, that's okay. Pay me when you can. And he would bring up loads of bacon and flour and rice. He would bring up loads from wagons from Portland to feed his people. And it saved Centralia, it saved people, and there are families. We have some really interesting stories that have survived of families who were really on the edge.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yes.
And he and Mary Jane taught them how to be
More
successful people, and it's very inspiring. And Edna brought along this book, Centralia, the First 50 Years, is a really interesting historical book about George, and some of the stories in here are just so inspiring, and we're going to be sharing those throughout the bicentennial as well.
I thought one thing was so interesting. If he'd see the little boys running around that didn't have any shoes or were poor shoes, he'd say, you just go down to that bar store, and at the end of the month, he would just go in and pay for all those shoes that those little boys, or probably girls too, put on. Just one act of his kindness.
And he was a very deeply Christian man. He and Mary Jane were very religious, and he gave land or sold it for $1 a couple times to build different churches, right? And one of the churches he built himself, partly. I mean,
Yes.
he went out and he cut down
hewed
the trees.
land and everything
Yes.
for the
Yeah.
Baptist church.
Baptist Church.
Cut the timbers, put them in place. So do you want to talk a little bit about his interaction with the churches there?
Yes, and then I want to bring back in the Boris family again
Yeah.
because I like that so well. But Mary Boris' mother and father, James and Emmeline Roundtree, built the first church in Australia just out at Ford's Prairie in 1871. And then they dismantled it 6 years later and brought it in right to Front Street. Now, Front Street were the two streets ran right by the railroad track. So they put it right there and on that lot, and they went to George Washington, and he gave them that lot for $1. And so that lot that he put on was because of him. And so it's kind of interesting how the families interweave and how they helped each other so much. And now I have a kind of project too, and I'd like to put a pioneer church out there at the Boris land, which has a pioneer school, and that would make it sort of like a pioneer village. You put the blockhouse and you walk the walk, and it just seems like that would kind of be a contribute to both the Rowntrees and the Boris, but also to George Washington.
Yeah, it's great, and I just have to make a plug here for Jean. It's neat. If you come down to Centralia, we have this historic Borst home, which is 167 years old, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous home, pioneer home, one of the oldest in the state, I think. Amazingly beautiful. Right next to it, there's a replica schoolhouse from the Pioneer era. And now Gene and some others have a dream of building a Pioneer church there as well, which would be the kind of place that George Washington would have worshiped in, and some other folks as well. So that's a project that we're doing in Centralia, or trying to build a Pioneer church. So continuing on with George's life, he kind of rescued the town and helped it go, and he was becoming an old man.
Oh, let's talk about the sad part about Mary Jane dying.
Please, yeah.
yes.
She became very sick, and her son, Stacy, he ran the whole trip down the railroad track to Chehalis, to Dr. Herndon, to come right away to save him. But he was too late. And so she never got to see that he married this beautiful, lovely lady who was a concert pianist and just beautiful. And she came to Centralia and even taught in a small school outside of town, and even in Centralia, taught school there. And they had a child named Audrey, and he never got to see any of that. And
George didn't, yeah. So we have on the screen here, so that on the left is Stacy Kunis Jr., so that's George's stepson in his later life.
Oh, okay.
And on the right is his daughter, Audrey.
Audrey.
So Stacy had married
Vitrina, or he called her Rena.
Rena, an amazing woman who became a school teacher in Centralia for many years. And then that was their daughter, Audrey, who was very accomplished and sad.
Oh, yes. She was concert pianist in Portland, played for all the leading churches and everything.
Born in Centralia, George Washington's step-granddaughter, and just amazing. And sadly, she died, in her 20s?
20s.
Yeah.
She got, was it tuberculosis?
I think so, yeah. And Stacy, so George's stepson, his wife died as well.
And they all sang. George would walk down the street singing and singing.
Yeah.
So did Stacy, and so did Rena. But after Audrey died, Rena never sang again,
Stacey.
and she died. She died just shortly after her daughter.
Yeah.
And then Stacy was not as happy either.
Yeah. Yeah. So as George got older, he was he became a wealthy man, a successful man. He developed his sites, town sites, and sold them, and would build a new one and sell it. And then he was very hale and hearty into his 80s, and then I think he was on a wagon and was thrown from a wagon. Is that right?
Oh, did you talk about him marrying?
Married, second
yeah,
time.
let's
He had
back up,
two
okay.
wives. He had
Yeah.
two wives.
His first wife, Mary Jane, who founded the town, and then passed away in 1889, just as the town was picking up.
And the year we were
Became a state. Yes.
Yep, she died shortly before statehood. So a few years later, George remarried a woman that had been helping out in his house. And so he then had a couple stepchildren that, kind of an insta family kind of came in. And then he and his second wife had a child. So this is George's only child. It was named George Cleveland Washington.
Yes.
Who then George raised and would just love this kid. And
the parents separated, but
parents separated.
And George Cleveland was named after, of course, George Washington himself, and then Cleveland, the name of the president then, too.
So we had all sorts of presidential names going on here.
Yes.
Now, should we talk about the poisoning? So that's quite a story. This is a mystery. There are some mysteries associated with George's life, but when his son, George Cleveland, was a boy, George went to bed one night, and he had, he took a swig to drink before he went to bed, and someone had put carbolic acid in the jar by his bed, and so all of a sudden, he's feeling fire in his mouth, and so he's yelling, and little George runs out in the street and says, Papa's dying, and so they bring a doctor in, and it took days, and friends sat by George's bedside. And he eventually recovered from this, and it was a mystery. And they said, "Who
would do this?"
Who would do this?" And George kind of cryptically said, "Oh, there are people in town who don't like me." But it's a mystery, and who knows? And the other mystery, we alluded to it earlier, is George was rich, and he didn't necessarily trust banks, and he also didn't like paper money, because the story is at one point he had some money and the wind blew some of his bills into the fire. So he didn't like having paper bills. So he had gold coins, and the story goes that he hid these coins somewhere in Centralia, and they might still be there. We don't know. There could be literally buried treasure in Centralia from our founder. And so we don't want you to come digging up Centralia, please.
Right. Please.
But if by some chance you find it, just let us know so that we'll stop looking for it. You're welcome to keep it, but just let us know that you found it so we can put a check mark next to that. So George ended up dying in 1905
5.
after an accident where he had been thrown from a buggy, very sadly. And he was a beloved man. He was in his 80s when he died and was still very active in town. And his, do you want to talk about his funeral?
Well, I was going to say his estate back then, $150,000. That was quite a bit of money to have in your estate. And you think about the money he gave away, and then people did pay him back, but that still was a lot of money, and his age was pretty old for that era too, to have lived that long in spite of the poisoning.
Yeah.
That all went to his son,
George Cleveland,
George
yeah.
Cleveland.
Yeah.
But tell about just end with his ending too.
Yeah, well, George Cleveland, George's son, unfortunately, he died shortly after George did, just a few years later. And I guess it's worth saying that George's son, George Cleveland Washington, was a hero. He died a heroic death. It was really amazing. He was going to school in Vashon Island, and there was a fire in one of the dormitories, and George Cleveland Washington ran in to try to rescue people and put the fire out as a teenager, and he ended up having smoke inhalation and some injuries, and so he died as a result of being a hero in that fire, which is just, it's sad, but it also sort of speaks to the character of the Washington family. So getting back to George and his 1905 funeral, he was buried in the church that he built.
He built, yes.
And the mayor at the time asked all the businesses to shut down in mourning,
Yes.
as a show of
Tribute.
respect for George. And they say that funeral was the biggest that the town had ever seen.
Yes.
That George was so beloved that they just filled up the church to honor him, and a neat life and a neat tribute to his life. So that was 1905. Now we're entering the 200th year of George's birth, and so we again are going to have a bicentennial celebration this year that we're really excited about. So if you're watching this, you'd like to be involved, we do have a website. It's ourgeorgewashington.com. So OUR. GeorgeWashington.com. He belongs to us.
Yes, he does.
He's not the president. He's the possession of the people of the Pacific Northwest, I think. So we're going to have a lot of events. We're going to have a lot of fun. We would love to have you come down to Centralia. It's a neat town that George founded, and it's his legacy. We have a downtown that is thriving. We have a McMenamin's pub and hotel there that actually has a George Washington room. You could stay in the George Washington room at the Olympic Club Hotel. We have monuments to him around town, to George. At the Centralia College, there's a clock tower that has a diversity panel that he and Mary Jane were the first entrants there. So yeah, Edna, tell us a little more about
I was going to say, also there's a Facebook page so people can enjoy the group, and there's a lot of things that are posted there. And so if you have questions or thoughts or suggestions for us, we'd certainly appreciate that. And we have a lot of people who are researching the history because, like I said earlier, there's a lot of history there we're finding out that was never recorded in some of these books. And when I have my hand on this book again, I just want to comment that this book was written by students in 1942, and it was Herndon Smith's class who did this. And if we didn't have this book that tells all of our Centralia history from 1845 to 1900, we would not have a clue on some of the things that happened in our
And this
era.
is called Centralia, the First 50 Years. So this is available in the library system, and this is a great book. The other one that Edna had mentioned is called The Land Called Lewis. And I don't know if Edna mentioned, but she was one of the researchers for this book. And it's just a great resource for the history of Lewis County. And we are, I think, probably going to wrap up. Any closing thoughts you'd want to share about George or our bicentennial?
It is amazing to me that this man could inspire and encourage and bring about such a change in people. That thought they were down and out and couldn't do anything for themselves, and that increasingly exciting thing is a part of I think our heritage today from his beginning and from his longing to make Centralia his city.
And he could have given up early on, you know, the way his life started, and many of the legislatures having to help him out at times when, I mean, it's a complete miracle when you think about what happened. and that he came to do all the things he did in Centralia. We have a lot to learn from him.
Yeah, and when we talk about a town in the Oregon Territory founded by an African American couple, there are still a lot of racial wounds in our country, and there certainly were at the time. He settled here in the years before the Civil War. There was a lot of animosity, and there's one story that comes down to us that's just really inspiring to me, and that was in one of the homes that George lived in. Someone moved in next door, and this person didn't like blacks, didn't want to live next to one, so this guy built a wall between their properties. He didn't want his kids associating, and George just kept being George, and was just a wonderful human being. And after a short period of time, the neighbor who absolutely didn't want to live next to a black man and had built a wall, he cut a hole in his wall and so that he could visit his beloved neighbor. And to me, that is an image of what is possible and what George Washington accomplished in his life. And the town of Centralia is his legacy, it's his monument, and we're just really honored to be part of that legacy. We're excited about his bicentennial. We're going to have a great time looking at George Washington's life, a man who was born and faced slavery, but instead he came west as a pioneer. America went through the Civil War. George founded a town, and the town is thriving still. And we do remember our founder. We're proud of our founder. We're excited to honor him. So come down to Centralia and join us.
Yes,
Come on,
please
join
do.
us.
On August 12th of this year, we're going to have a big birthday party for George Washington. And if you can't make that, come down in August of 2018. We'll help us dedicate our statue to George and Mary Jane Washington. And we're just excited. Thank you for joining us
Thank
and
you.
learning
Thank
about
you.
George.